All right, hi folks. Hello again. This is your instructor, Mr. Matt. First exam came and went. Seems like for the most part everyone did pretty well. I don't know what the average grade is. It seems like most people did fairly well on it from what I can see so far. So half the class down, half to go, one exam down, one to go. Half the discussion boards are done, half to go, so that's 3 down, 3 to go. Remember, the next one is due Friday night at midnight. What else? One writing assignment down, one to go. Your next one is due the 5th. And as I said in the email I sent the class, I put all the details in there for that assignment. That covers one of my favorite topics, as I mentioned, feral children. I think children are often feral, whether they're socialized properly or not. But that assignment kind of asks you to think about and kind of review and reflect on everything we learned in the first half of the class in chapters 1, 2, 4, and 5. So, or is it 1, 2, 4, and 6? Whatever it is we did up till now. So, yeah, I think that should be kind of a fun assignment for you. And a little more specific in terms of the content than the first writing assignment. So I think that's it for administrative stuff. So today, this is the video lecture for Chapter 7, Confronting Economic Inequality. I'm not going to try to spend too much time on this chapter, although I feel like I say that every video lecture, and they end up being like a week long. But I think there's maybe more material in this chapter that maybe you can more easily teach yourself compared to other chapters. So to start with economic inequality, we're thinking about what is the distribution of economic resources in a society. And usually, almost always, that's an unequal distribution. And so generally that just means some people have more resources than others. In a capitalist economy, that would be money, because we use money as a currency by which to determine value for goods and services. So we no longer live in a bartering economy where we just always traded. So now there's some kind of generally universal form of currency we use to determine value. And so as I mentioned, obviously some people have more than others. Some people have more food than others. They can afford more and better food compared to others. They live in bigger houses and nicer neighborhoods than others. Some people own the land their house sits on. Some people don't. Some people own animals by which they make some of their own food. Some people don't. So think of all the various things that we need to survive. That includes transportation. Some people are solely reliant on public transportation. And so this unequal distribution is kind of how we think about economic inequality. So obviously the title of the chapter, Inequality, implies that some have more and some have less. It's not the economic equality chapter. And there is no chapter like that in the book or any sociology book. So kind of the three ways to think about economic inequality within our three major sociological paradigms. The first one is functionalism. And so within the functionalist framework for economics, we can think about everyone having their place in what's called the division of labor. And so the division of labor is how a society might be organized. Think about how a sports team might be organized. You have different positions. Some are more important than others. Some are central, some are peripheral. Think like center field in baseball, center midfield in soccer. And then you have more peripheral positions. So I think in baseball, the least important position is it right field or is it left field? It's left field because very few batters are left-handed. And so it's the place where the ball goes the least. In soccer, some might think it's goalie. In baseball, it might be catcher. In soccer, it may also be like left defense, maybe. So there are obviously positions that are just more important based on where they're at on the playing field and how often they have to interact in the field of play. And so basically just some positions are more important than others. And so we can think about in that way those teams and their hierarchical organization. You know, some players play all the time, some players rarely play. Some players are role players and can play multiple positions. Others can only play really one position. Some people can only coach, maybe because they were never very good or because they're too old. And so this is what in sociology we call the division of labor, which is having maybe a specialized role, but if not a specialized role, then a defined role, which can include more than one role, compared to other people and what their roles might be. And so people have a role or specific roles within some type of broader organizational structure, so we're using this as an allegory to think about how society works. And so when we think about the division of labor, we think about that largely going back to small primitive societies where everyone had really one specific job based on their physical abilities. So in this case, this is kind of the beginnings of what we might think about being a meritocracy, which is that people earn whatever it is they work for, have the ability to work for, and their outcome is based on talent, merit, performance, and success. So it's kind of the beginnings of what we oftentimes call a meritocracy. Which is basically just, the best to each person's ability. So the conflict theory version of that is that when people get in an important position, let's say they're a quarterback on the football team, point guard in basketball, head ballerina in the local ballet company. You can tell I'm stretching my knowledge here, but I'm trying to get this to appeal to everybody. Maybe head cellist or violinist in local symphony. Top runner on the cross-country team, whatever the case may be. That they will do everything in their power, including potentially unethical things, to maintain their position of power. So they actively try to keep people from being able to compete with them. They may also achieve their top position in the division of labor through means other than hard work and talent. Maybe they bribed the coach. Maybe their parents knew the coach. Maybe they had friends on the team. Someone else is a total nobody and doesn't know anybody on the team. So these kind of extracurricular reasons, or these additional social reasons, play a role in someone succeeding. So there's that phrase that it's not what you know, but who you know. That would be really part of the conflict perspective, that it's that connections and status within a group matter equally, maybe even more, compared to just sheer talent. Think, for example, when two people are equally talented, generally speaking, but maybe someone's mom went to high school with the coach, whereas maybe your parents are new to town because you just moved there and you're nobodies. So those social connections can play a role, even sometimes without us being aware of it. So this can happen on an unconscious level. We're not always conscious of the way these things affect our decision making. And so the conflict perspective is helpful for thinking about when two people are equally talented, what extra additional factors may play a role in why someone is more successful than someone else. So the conflict perspective doesn't mean people can't overcome their circumstances, but it's certainly having us think about some people just have more obstacles to reach the same finish line than other people. So imagine maybe being the only ethnic minority on a team, and maybe everyone on the team doesn't have a lot of experience with someone from a different culture who doesn't look like them. They may not be as likely to interact and become friends with that person compared to someone who looks like them. Doesn't mean they're going out of their way to exclude them and be mean to them, which of course can happen. But in other cases, they don't really know how to integrate that person into the group because they seem different. So the conflict perspective isn't always about being a jerk. Sometimes it's how we deal with difference. And sometimes it's just that sometimes we do things to help out our friends. It doesn't necessarily mean we're excluding people who are not our friends, although it can definitely mean that for anyone who's seen the show Mean Girls, or no, that's a movie, the movie Mean Girls, or think of how like sororities and fraternities work, for any of you who are in those. Obviously, overt forms of exclusion can occur. And then the kind of symbolic interactionist perspective to economic life would be that people attach different types of value to different things. And those things have status within societies, but not everyone attaches the same status to them. So for example, some people really value home ownership and see that as a sign of social success. Other people don't want that responsibility and think that home ownership is really just too much. It's too much financial cost and kind of physical responsibility for the upkeep than it is returning on financial value. And so this plays a role in how we measure economic success, because prestige and status can play a role in how we think about what professions we want. So, for example, a real estate agent, a college professor, a church minister or priest, and a firefighter all may make roughly around the same income. But obviously they have very different places in society and different types of status, and different types of status people attach to what they do compared to other professions, even though they all make around the same amount of money. So certain occupations have more social prestige than others, even when the income they make is the same. So we kind of think of like maybe being a college professor as like a cool job. Being a firefighter, we think No, that seems dangerous. I'm much too likely to get caught on fire. And that does not seem fun. Being a minor league professional athlete at a low level, say like single A baseball, semi-professional hockey, something like that. You might make the same amount of money, roughly 40 grand, as, I don't know, being like a decent level manager at a Best Buy. But which occupation has more social prestige? Which one is most likely to get you free drinks at the bar? And so prestige is a way of thinking about what in sociology we call status, and status compared to class. Class being where you're at in the economic hierarchy just based on, how much money you have, where you're at in like what tax bracket are you in. But then status are these more qualitative rather than quantitative things we use to think about social success and social standing. So living in an affluent suburb compared to living in the inner city, whether you go to a public school or a private school. These are these things that also determine social value and social standing, but we also view them through an economic lens. It also reminds me, we want to know the difference between income and wealth. Income is what we make to take care of our basic living expenses, what we use to pay our bills and go to the grocery store. Wealth, and by contrast, is really our savings. Also assets, things we've invested in, like if you own your car, if you own your house, what you have in your savings. So you can think of the difference between income and wealth as maybe how much extra money do you have on hand right now to jaunt on a vacation? That's the difference between income and wealth. So income is kind of what's there, what's available. Income is what you have coming in on a periodic basis, usually payroll. Payrolls are every 2 weeks. I get paid by University of Buffalo every 2 weeks. It's every other Wednesday. Some professions might be monthly, might be weekly, but income is basically your paycheck that you get at some periodic interval, whereas wealth is what you have available to access. It might be hidden under your mattress. It might be invested in bricks of cocaine that you have hidden in a storage unit, which I hope applies to nobody in this class, and I did not give you that idea. Let's just forget that ever happened. Whereas, a car is an example of wealth. That's something of value that you could sell and get money back on if you had to in an emergency. What else do we got here? So when thinking about wealth, money, income, economic standing, so we're thinking about this in terms of inequality. On page 124, figure 7.1, we get a basic chart that gives us some ideas about where wealth is concentrated in our country. So the richest 20% of families, so the top 1 out of 5, to break it down, the top fifth, owns almost 90% of the wealth. That's a lot. So 20% owns 90%. That means that the highest 20% also earn almost 2/3 of all available income in the country. Because obviously we have really high paying professions, like being a corporate CEO or a corporate lawyer or be working in high finance. being an architectural engineer. So obviously there were some very high-paying professions. Moving to figure 7.2, this also varies greatly by race and ethnicity. So in figure 7.2, we see that white net worth is 13 times greater compared to African Americans, 10 times greater compared to Hispanics. So that means that controlling for population size, white people hold more wealth compared to economic minorities as a whole, but also when we break ethnic minorities down into specific groups. So if you look at figure 7.2, that has us thinking about there are lots of different types of inequality: gender, race, class, ability, place, sexual orientation, that we've talked about generally speaking in this class so far, but that also we can think about within the specific context of economic inequality. All right, moving on. Already gone 21 minutes. I'm not trying to keep you here forever. I know I always say that. So I've kind of jumped. I'm on page 130, which is called Examining the Class System. And so social class is a way of thinking about status and class together. So remember, status involves some of these more kind of social things that I talked about, these things that have prestige factors, whereas your class standing is really like what tax bracket you're in. And so these two combined form your social class. So for example, think about the upper class. What are some of the kind of cultural tastes and social decisions people with lots of expendable income make? I'm going to tell you. They may live in very affluent suburbs, think like gated communities, so they only kind of live among people like themselves. They send their kids to exclusive private schools. They have expensive memberships to selective clubs like yacht clubs, boat clubs, country clubs, golf clubs. A lot of those types of membership groups are invitation only, meaning someone has to invite you in. And so this can create a kind of a bubble, a social bubble, where people are only know and understand people like themselves, and they take that as normal and then can pathologize people who are of a lower class standing than them. So this does something for what we think about, for how we think about what is normal. And so this is what in sociology we call social class reproduction. Is that people with more power and influence transmit their cultural values, often through parenting, to their children. And so this type of social separation then has intergenerational effects. Middle class. Our textbook authors, I think, kind of arbitrarily define the middle class as earning between $48,000 and $145,000. I think there are a lot of people who make a lot more than $145,000. So this is page 133. I think there are a lot of people who make a lot more than $145,000, especially depending on whether they own a house in a city, which usually have higher property taxes. So I would say middle class, accounting for variation in geography, could even go up to like $250,000. There could be some of you in this class watching this lecture whose parents' combined incomes are more than $145,000 and you feel middle class, not necessarily upper middle class. And I think that's a legitimate feeling. So defining the middle class can be hard when we think about, is it a rural or urban area? Is it suburban? What is the average income for that area? Working class we define as 20 to 38,000. Lower class, which tends to be more kind of semi-employed, 17,000. But we still need these kind of arbitrary, quantitative measurements for class so we can have an absolute poverty standard. So absolute poverty is when a household or individual fails to have the income required to meet our basic human needs of subsistence, like food and rent, clothing, particularly during cold months. Relative poverty is when maybe you might be technically poor based on, say, your tax status. But if you live in a poor neighborhood around a lot of people like you, and you have the life you're living reflected back to you by your peers, this is what we call relative poverty, because you may not feel that poor since lots of people around you are going through the same struggles that you are. So it's important to know that distinction between absolute poverty and relative poverty. And we can think about, I think that as well in terms of absolute affluence versus relative affluence. You might have grown up in with a comfortable suburban life, but your parents may have absolutely worked their asses off for you to have that comfortable life, in which case you feel kind of a middle class. And generally a middle class life we define by, kind of demanding work life. And so you have a level of absolute affluence, but it feels relatively less affluent because everyone around you seems to be just working at this breakneck pace. And so everything I mentioned has implications for upward mobility, downward mobility, and intergenerational mobility. So intergenerational mobility, if you don't know, means the ability to reach a higher social standing than your parents, oftentimes by the age your parents were when they became parents. That can obviously be hard to measure because oftentimes subsequent generations have children at later ages than their parents. That's particularly true of our current generation who are starting to have kids, millennials, as well as Generation Z that follows millennials. So people are having kids later than they used to, and so determining intergenerational mobility becomes a little bit more difficult. But you can largely think about it generally as reaching do I have a gray hair? I feel like I see a big gray streak. Maybe that's just sunlight. My vanity is showing through. I have enough gray hair here. I don't need any here. So we generally define intergenerational mobility as achieving a higher social standing and class standing than your parents. But that can become more difficult based on structural shifts. So for example, my parents, my dad was born in the 40s, my mom was born in the 50s. A college education for that generation wasn't as necessary as it was, say, for my generation. I was born in the 1980s. A lot of you were probably born in the 2000s, maybe late 90s or 2000s. And so obviously for our generation, your generation compared to my parents' generation, your parents' generation who were probably born most likely in the 60s and 70s, a college education is much more important. But college education takes 4 years. So that means you're maybe not starting your major work life until 22 rather than 18. That delays marriage, delays having children. So people are starting their lives later So in which case, defining intergenerational mobility can become a little difficult because there are different constraints and necessities on young people now to achieve a certain economic standing compared to multiple decades ago. So this is what we call changes in structural mobility. And this is when economic changes basically create or destroy jobs. And so the jobs available, particularly industrial jobs, available to people without a college degree are scarce compared to what they were in the 70s and 80s. So this is largely due to deindustrialization, which is caused by a combination of things like globalization, automation, so like more efficient production technologies. There's just different types of work available now compared to decades ago. Now we live in the digital age. So I want you to touch on yourselves, pages 136 to 130, or no. Yeah, pages like 141. So we also want to think about the consequences of economic inequality for some major institutions and variables in sociology. So this will be an opportunity for you to teach yourselves a little bit, but think about the relationship between economic standing and education, economic standing and health, particularly life expectancy, economic standing and housing and location, like what kind of neighborhood or town or city you grew up in. So all of these things have implications for social mobility, life expectancy, economic outcomes, professional success, things of that nature. So I would look over those sections to get a sense of the various ways your economic standing influences your outcomes. So I think that's all I'm going to focus on for this chapter. I'll leave the other parts for you to focus on yourself. We will have future chapters delving more deeply into gender and race and ethnicity, so I touched on those things. For those of you who are really interested in those particular topics, we'll dive into them deeply in and of themselves in future chapters. So generally in sociology, we think about variations and outcomes for people across things like race, class, gender, sexuality, disability, etc., as I've mentioned throughout this course. I also added a lot of additional material to UB Learns for this chapter to give you a sense about those kind of intersectional aspects. So there are a lot of videos about kind of economics and race, economics and gender, economics and housing on UB Learns for you to view that I think will give you some additional examples and kind of material to think about with to understand this chapter. Remember, there's an outline for this chapter as well to use, particularly for exam preparation. I think that is about it for now. So, for example, our next chapter is on gender, sex, and sexuality. Sometimes in sociology, we tease those two apart. So, gender we think of as our kind of self-presentation that has some type of relationship, either expressive or oppositional to our biological sex. And so, sex is biology, gender is social, sexuality is, who we choose to be romantically and sexually involved with, what we're attracted to, what we don't want to do, pleasure, desire, all that kind of stuff. But for this textbook in this chapter, they're looped together. And of course, they're not mutually exclusive. That's kind of previewing our next chapter. And about to hit minute 35, so that's all for now. I'll talk to you soon.